Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I'm with Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective that you're not going to get in the mainstream media on the burning issues of the day. And we're going to talk about yesterday, which of course was Memorial Day, where the government asks us to honor, all the soldiers that have been killed in these foreign wars for what they call freedom. And, the way I figure it is that this is just propagandistic nonsense. If you look at these wars, how many people have died for freedom? I mean, you look at Vietnam, for example. I mean, that's the one that touches close to home for me. They sacrificed 58,000 American men for what? For freedom? I mean, really, they sacrificed them for nothing because, if the war had been won, they would have said, oh, well, if we hadn't gone to Vietnam, the communists would have come and taken over America. Well, but the war was lost, and the communists did not come over and take over America, which is a pretty persuasive proof that those soldiers died for absolutely nothing. And it's the same with the Korean War and, of course, World War I, total waste of American life. All it did was give rise to World War II. And even if you look at the consequences of World War II, Eastern Europe taken over by the communists, China taken over by the communists, the Cold War, the national security state, Korea, Vietnam, that's nothing to crow about either. So, I think we need to keep this in mind, that these soldiers that died in these wars, they didn't die for freedom. They died for nothing. What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, I agree with that. They died for politicians who, wanted to go down in history or make their name somehow, or were involved in some sort of intrigue. That's what they died for. I try to point this out every year on my blog, Free Association, where I've renamed Memorial Day Revisionist History Day as my way of encouraging people to read revisionist accounts of these wars. History properly done always should be revisionist, because new historians should always be looking at what previous historians have done to see whether there are better interpretations of what went on. But in particular, revisionist history gets going right after World War I as a way of checking the official version of events. They had a distrust of the politicians' stories about how wars began, why the country got into war, what the aftermath was, how valiantly it was fought, all those sorts of things. They realized that the politicians do have an incentive to not be entirely forthcoming, so they would go back and read and look afresh at what was going on before a war begins or before a particular country gets into a war. And Americans have done that too, both with World War I, with World War II, with all the wars that have occurred since. And it's just a natural libertarian attitude that we can't count on politicians to be telling us the truth. So that's why we need to be interested in revisionist history, which is what I try to do. I have a reading list if anybody wants to find it at sheldonrichmond.com. There's a partial reading list of books that would be good to start with. But this is extremely important. War is obviously the worst thing governments can do, and therefore we ought to be very wary about the government's conduct and always be checking it.
Yeah, that's a great point about revisionist history. When I first discovered this whole genre, this literature on revisionist history, especially with respect to America's foreign wars, I was absolutely stunned. And it really opened my eyes, and the scales fell from my eyes the same way as when I discovered the economic aspects of libertarianism. And I learned that, after World War I, the American people were absolutely disgusted with the results of World War I. I mean, what had those men what did they die for in World War I? I mean, absolutely nothing. And this is what our founding fathers, our ancestors warned us against. Stay out of those foreign wars. And so what did World War I do? It really just gave rise to the conditions of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime that then leads to World War II. And yesterday in our FFF Daily, which of course is free for anybody that wants to subscribe to it, we link to 10 of the articles that we've published over the years. There are many more on the so-called good war, World War II, that, that really justifies foreign interventionism. That's the one they always point to. And in a technical sense, they're right. America gets attacked. Even libertarians would say, the nation should defend itself. But we go deeper than that. We show the consequences of World War II. They get involved. The English do to save Poland from the tyranny of the Nazis. And by the end of the war, what's left? All of Eastern Europe and half of Germany is in the hands of the Soviet communists for the next half century or so. They didn't consider that any great victory, and so that's really what American men were dying for on the European battlefield, so that the Soviet Union could control Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany rather than Nazi Germany. That's no great winning thing to die for. And then over in China, you've got that turning communist. You've got the whole rise of the national security state, which took America to the dark side with LSD experiments on innocent people with the CIA and the assassination attempts, the coups, the support of dictatorships, the big standing army, the foreign overseas bases, Korea, Vietnam, on and on and on, now Iraq and Afghanistan. These are the types of things that we libertarians question, and we bring to the attention of the American people that you're just not going to find in the mainstream press, Sheldon.
That's right, and that's why we always have our work cut out for us. People do have this tendency, especially when it comes to war, to believe their government, even though when they're skeptical about domestic affairs. They just have this sense that now they wouldn't be lying about that. Politics stops at the water's edge and all that kind of thing. But we just know repeatedly from war after war that it's the public version of it is never really what really went on. I mean, you mentioned Vietnam. It was presented as some sort of global, sort of noble crusade. And yet we know from the Pentagon Papers, which had been leaked in 1970 by Daniel Ellsberg, that, it was nothing of the sort. They knew they couldn't even win it on their own terms. They knew it was just going to be this long grind. But, Johnson, by that point, Johnson was afraid of the Republicans. So he just kept sending men into the meat grinder, by the way, also killing 2 million Vietnamese and totally, tearing that place apart. And you're right. The consequences that the reason that we had to fight that war never came about. If the U.S. obviously didn't get taken over by the communists, but even Japan didn't get taken over by the communists, which was the thing they used to talk about. The domino theory would lead to a fall to all these Southeast Asian nations, ending with the biggest prize, which would be Japan. Well, it never happened and never came close. Vietnam's a trading partner today. And it's the same story with any of these wars if you look closely at them. And that goes for, what's usually considered the last good war, namely World War II, where our partner was Stalin, who invaded Poland the same time that Germany did and was Germany's ally for a while until Hitler ended up attacking Russia, and then the Russians drove them back, leaving them in control of half of Europe. So, luckily we have plenty of authors out there who are doing very good work, well documented. There are new books every year to take a fresh look at these things, and the literature's there if people are interested in it, but they should not take at face value what the politicians tell them about any particular war.
Well, that's why your piece on your blog yesterday is so fantastic, because you've got this nice reading list there, Revisionist Literature. When I first discovered this literature, I was just stunned. Just that simple basic fact that you point out, that the U.S., that here the Nazis have partnered with the Soviet communists to invade Poland. And for some reason, England declares only war on Nazi Germany and not the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union was there acting in partnership. And then we end up, the United States and England, partnering with the Soviet communists after Hitler double crosses his partner and invades the Soviet Union. And we end up partnering with the communist regime. And then as soon as the war is over, start initiating this huge, big Cold War against our former partner and ally that gives rise to this whole dark side that the national security state has taken us over all the subsequent years. And then the other aspect of this, Sheldon, is that There's all the literature about what Roosevelt did to provoke the Japanese into attacking the United States. Now, there's some debate whether he knew that there was going to be specifically an attack at Pearl Harbor, but there's no question, it seems to me, that he was doing everything he could, despite his promises to the American people that I will keep your boys out of foreign wars. That's what he promised in 1940, which is indicating that this is what Americans want. We don't want our boys fighting in these foreign wars anymore. And he outmaneuvers the American people who steadfastly were opposed to entry into another European war. He outmaneuvers them, and of course, then you end up with this whole giant, furnace of death and destruction that's World War II, and that, it, like I say, gives rise to the communist takeover of Eastern Europe, China, and so forth. Now, I wanted to mention, though, that you also wrote a great article for us in your TGIF article on John Bright. And there's a lot of people that are not familiar with John Bright, certainly not going to read about Bright in the mainstream media. Tell us a little bit about John Bright and what your article was about.
Well, John Bright was one of the great advocates of peace, free trade, and free markets generally in 19th century Britain. He's not quite as well known as his colleague and co-conspirator, so to speak, Richard Cobden. The two of them founded the Anti-Corn Law League, which was intended to end the tariffs on foreign grain, which was starving, the working class in Britain and enriching the landed aristocracy. Because obviously their grain was more expensive if you could put a very high tariff on foreign grains. Corn back then meant grain in general. But they always linked, the two of them, Bright and Cobden, always linked the free trade and the cause with the peace cause. In fact, Cobden called them one and the same. They never saw any difference. They thought trade discouraged people from going to war because you don't normally go attack your trading partner. And they thought that was the best hope. But they also were specifically against British intervention on the continent and anywhere else in order to manage the balance of power or acquire territory. They were critical of the colonization of India and Ireland, and they were both eloquent. What I focused on in the article on Friday was Bright's three of Bright's speeches. One which was on the floor of the Parliament. They both served in Parliament, and then two other speeches before private gatherings, where he eloquently goes through all the reasons to be against war and foreign intervention by England. Not just the fact that they kill people, they maim people, but also the economic damage, the damage to liberty, debt, all the things we're talking about today. So these speeches are entirely relevant. People are free to go look at it at fff.org. And there are further links to the full speeches and other Bright material if you're interested. But he's one of the great heroes in my view.
Yeah, I think so too. He and Richard Cobden, and the fact that they were able to mobilize the poor in England to favor free trade was just fantastic. I mean, poor people realized that all this government protectionism was not in their interests at all. And Bastiat makes this point too, Sheldon, about that a society in which there's free trade and open borders and open immigration is a society in which societies in which there's less incentive to go to war because of the interdependencies that are created, the economic interdependencies that are created among people. That when people are free to get what they want through trade, the incentive to invade another country to get resources and so forth diminishes. And I think that when you look at the founding principles of this country, now there's big exceptions. We know that slavery and tariffs and a lot of other smaller exceptions. But when you look at the basic idea of having no standing army to speak of, basic military force, but the government limited to protecting the United States from invasion instead of this foreign empire business, and you got open immigration that says to the world, look, we know you're suffering tyranny and oppression and starvation in different parts of the world, but we're not going to send our government abroad in search of monsters to destroy, the way John Quincy Adams put it. We're not going to do that. That would kill a lot of innocent people. Instead, we're just going to provide a sanctuary for you. That if you can get out of there and you come to the United States, we won't forcibly return you. It seems to me, Sheldon, that is the ideal way that you help people. And if somebody's outraged by tyranny and oppression, an American, he can go overseas and help people in the resistance or the rebellion or whatever, but keep the government here at home.
Right, and that's what classical liberals and what we call today libertarians have said throughout American history, and then going back to Europe with both Bastiat, who was a friend of Cobden's, and they were both on the same side. I mean, Bastiat. The phrase is attributed to Bastiat: "If goods can't cross borders, soldiers will." If he didn't say exactly those words, that was certainly the essence of what he was teaching in the relationship between peace and economic freedom, or free trade in all respects, both domestic and foreign. That's why, and that got sort of lost, in the time of the Cold War, where there was some, at least in the eyes of some libertarians, there was a sort of an alliance of convenience with Cold War conservatives. This sometimes got lost, and there was some division among libertarians during Vietnam, but there was a strong aspect of the movement that insisted that this war was like other wars and needed to be opposed, that the government just gains power, it conscripts. Now, it hasn't conscripted since Vietnam, luckily, but it can invoke that power. 18-year-olds are still obligated under the law to register for a non-existent draft. That's never ended. Republicans who claim to be advocates of individual freedom have not saw fit to end that, which I think can be ended by a executive order. It came in under Carter, but Reagan did not stop it, and Bush did not stop it, and neither Bush stopped it. And so we still have this form, selective service still exists for the day that they may decide they want to conscript again. But government just gains powers. We know from Robert Hicks's book, Crisis and Leviathan, echoing Randolph Bourne, war is the health of the state. The state grows through warfare. It accumulates powers, and it doesn't give them all up afterwards. They may put some on the shelf, but they're there. The president has been set, and they're there to be taken down at any time. And that's what we always have to be vigilant about.
Well, one of the real ironies of this Memorial Day, where they claim that all these soldiers died for freedom, is that President Obama, in his recent terrorism speech, quotes James Madison. And this stunned me. In fact, I wrote an article about it on my blog on Friday, or on Monday, sorry, where I say, here's Obama quoting Madison. And it just shocked me because we've been using this Madison quote ever since 9/11 and probably even before. It's the famous quote. Now Obama only used the last sentence of the quote, which says that a nation could never preserve its freedom in the midst of continuous warfare. And he's talking about, hey, this war on terrorism has gone on for 12 years now. And of course, his administration is talking about another 10 years. So he's not exactly being consistent. But the whole quote that Madison uses is that of all the enemies to liberty, war is the worst. Now, get that, because they're saying all these guys died for freedom. Here is Madison saying war is the enemy of freedom. And he goes into talks about, as you pointed out, the centralization of power in government, the emoluments, the appointments of officers and all this, and, of course, the out-of-control spending that we've seen, the debt. I think Madison said it leads to debts and taxes and so forth. Well, so what I'm here arguing in my article is that look at what we've lived under ever since World War II. Constant crises, constant wars, constant chaos, and they tell us that this is just inevitable, that this is the way life is, and they call it freedom. I mean, they call this way of life freedom, where everybody just sits around fearful all the time. I suggest that it is a direct result of having adopted this national security state apparatus, the CIA, the huge standing military force, the overseas empire that really constituted an abandonment of the principles of liberty on which our country was founded. And that's the reason why we live lives of fear and chaos and crisis, and that's what we need to be debating in this country today. Is it time, and I would say it is time, past time, to dismantle this old Cold War archaic apparatus known as the national security state?
Yeah, that speech he gave on May 23rd at the National Defense University was really interesting, and it either showed his flagrant ignorance or how misleading and deceptive he could be, because he talked about how, in effect, he seemed to be saying, well, we can wind down the so-called war on terror, which was Bush's phrase, and he doesn't even use that phrase anymore. We can begin to wind that down because, Al-Qaeda, at least at its center, has been pulverized, and there's some affiliates now, but they're not quite the same. And he was in some ways implying the threat has diminished, so we don't need to be on a war footing. But what he never acknowledged, number one, is all the intervention in the Middle East that helped to stimulate that, but also before 9/11, it wasn't as if the U.S. was not on a war footing. Like you said, it was on a war footing, certainly from the Cold War onward. So, coming out of World War II, it never really left the war footing. It was still intervening in the early 50s, overthrowing governments like in Central America and Iran, and it was involved in coups that helped bring Saddam Hussein to power in Iraq. He makes it seem like it was only after 9/11 that the U.S. went into this perpetual war footing, and maybe now we ought to wind it down. What does he mean? We're going to go back to the pre-9/11 days? Well, that was not a Pacific America, America at peace. It was an America where they had the CIA all over the place, and armies sent in when any president thought it was necessary, packing death squads in Central America. And getting involved in civil wars all over the place. So, what is he talking about when he says we can go back and we don't have to be in this mode of continuous war? Yeah, it was a little cynical for him to be quoting Madison, I agree.
Yeah, and you're right. He plays the innocent. He says, "Oh, well, we were just minding our own business, and we were just going about the post Cold War era, and all of a sudden we just suddenly out of nowhere get attacked by the terrorists." And like I argued in my article yesterday, it's like the terrorists is like the flu. It just sort of it struck our nation. Isn't that unfortunate? But ironically, it hasn't struck Switzerland. And of course, and it's really just a variation of George W. Bush's line of the terrorists hate us for our freedom and values, and that's why they attacked on 9/11. And this is the perspective that libertarians bring to this debate, and it's now on the table, and people are having to discuss it. And that's this issue of motivation. Of what was the U.S. government doing prior to 9/11? And as you point out, it wasn't just a little innocent babe in the woods. It was out doing some really horrific things in the Middle East, including the brutal sanctions against the Iraqi people that was killing hundreds of thousands of people, of children. Madeleine Albright's infamous statement where she says the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions are worth it, and she meant the worthy attempt to oust Saddam Hussein from power. You got the no-fly zones. You got the support of the dictatorships. That we often forget about this in all this democracy talk, that the U.S. government has been one of the premier supporters of brutal dictatorships around the world, including in Egypt, Chile, Iran, Guatemala, and so many other places. And I think this is what we need to be examining in this country. Not just whether we should get out of Afghanistan or not. That's a no-brainer. But really, the whole apparatus that has brought this thing into existence, the dark side, the LSD experiments on unsuspecting Americans as the CIA did, the partnerships with the mafia, the hiring of the Nazis, the coups, the assassinations, the regime change operations. This is what we need to be discussing and debating in this country, Sheldon.
Agreed. And as you mentioned earlier, so much of this goes back to World War I, and it relates to just what you said. Because one of the consequences of the U.S. getting into World War I was to enable Britain and France to have a decisive victory over Germany rather than just a negotiated settlement the way the Napoleonic Wars were settled. And that enabled the British and the French to betray their promises to the Arabs and carve up the Middle East and create nations and create colonies, basically, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. they broke their promise. They said the Arabs could be independent if they would join the effort against England's enemies in that war. And as a result, there's been this turmoil ever since, fighting over territory and corrupt leaders which have been put in by the Western powers. And then there's coups, and then it's this cycle of violence over and over again. We shouldn't leave Palestine and the Israel question out of this, because it's a big part of the headache we suffer today. And all that goes back to America helping England win World War I, which was World War I was the root of so much bad stuff in the 20th century and then now into the 21st century. It's just this is why people need to care about this. I memean, if they care about freedom and peace at home, they got to care about this stuff.
That's a great point, because, I often point out that, like in Iran, that, for a history for a lot of people, the interventionist begins with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where they took all those American diplomats hostage. But really, it goes back to 1953, when the CIA went in there and ousted from power in a surreptitious coup the democratically elected prime minister of the country, a man who had been Life magazine's Man of the Year, and they put in the Shah of Iran, a brutal unelected dictator who proceeds to brutalize his own people for the next 25 years, which is what precipitated the anger of the Iranian Revolution. And so we point these things out to show people this is a legacy of the national security state. But your point's fantastic, that the whole Middle East is the artificial lines of all these countries is a direct result of World War I. And that's what all this fighting is about, in large part, to try to keep these borders and these artificial lines intact, right?
Right, and that region was not able to sort of evolve without outside interference, violent interference, and that shaped the ensuing history. Instead of letting people over there sort things out, and by that I mean obviously there was going to be a struggle between more Orthodox and conservative Muslims versus the ones that were more interested in modernization. I think all religions go through that. Instead of Islam being able to go through that without outside interference, it was subjected to a great deal of outside interference, both from after the British and the French, then the U.S. And that has a lot to do with animosity against the United States. Obama, in his speech, said we have to understand that terrorism doesn't form in a vacuum. Which I thought, okay, great. What's he going to say next? He says it's not in a vacuum. It's the result of a violent ideology that believes that there's a clash with the West. Well, that didn't come in a vacuum either. To him, that's where apparently that does form in a vacuum. In fact, in modern history, it comes because Westerners have insisted on hegemony over the Middle East instead of letting people figure things out for themselves. And we're suffering the consequences of that today.
Well, you've got that great essay on your blog at freeassociation.com and or sheldonrichmond.com.
SheldonRichmond.com.
SheldonRichmond.com. It's called Free Association. And you've got that list of books yesterday. The title of the piece is Revisionist History. And you've got the long list of books. Is that included among there, like where people can learn this basic history of how U.S. interventionism led to all these problems in the Middle East?
Yeah, there are several books on there related to the Middle East. David Hurst's The Gun and the Olive Branch is very good in particular. That's specifically on Palestine, Israel. But there's some other on there, and then there's some more general books too. It's a fairly decent starting list. Many books could be added to it, and new books are being done all the time. We should be happy to see that. There are people really dedicated to telling the story.
What about that essay you wrote many years ago when you were at Cato about ancient history? Would that help people?
That was a long paper. That's right. I suppose I should put that up there. That was a long paper written for Cato. Came out in 1991, called "Ancient History: The Folly of U.S. Intervention in the Middle East since World War II." And it goes up to 1991, so it doesn't go past that. But there's a lot of detail there about what went on in the time of. It does go back, I think, to World War I, and then certainly once the U.S. picks up the the mantle. When the British are bankrupt after World War II, they basically turn it over to the United States. And the United States stepped right in there because, for a lot of reasons, but one reason is they wanted to control the oil. It was always a big factor that since we intended to be the superpower, we had to control the oil against any rivals, and that's a big motive. It may not be the only thing, but it certainly was very important. It still is.
Well, that pretty much wraps up the show. I guess, I'd sum it up by saying, that some people think that patriotism is just sort of a blind support of whatever the government wants people to support. And I say that genuine patriotism is taking a stand for what's right, and that it's the duty of a citizen to examine what the government's doing in a critical sense. And if the government's on the right track, it's the job of the citizenry to put it on the right track. And of course, that's what we're trying to do here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We'd love to have your support if you're viewing. And we've got a free daily FFF Daily, great libertarian publication. We've also got a monthly journal. That's by subscription. You can check it all out at fff.org. And that's a Libertarian Angle for this week. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you.